This business is growing. You can see that Joe and Susan have added a couple of new employees, and immediately Joe sees that this little hub is not going to satisfy what they need. And so out comes the hub, and Joe goes and finds him a much more sophisticated device called a switch. And here's the switch he bought. He bought a pretty good one, as it turns out. And so here we have, now we're going to connect our devices up to our switch now. And so here we're going to connect in this phone. And then here, now here you may see two ports. Two ports. One has an icon that has a little computer by it. One has an icon that has a little network beside it. So I would assume here that I plug this phone in to the network at the network port. But I wonder what that other port is. I wonder if I could plug my computer into that port. As it turns out I can't. And so what I have now is I have two devices running on one switch port. Now, what does that make this phone? You know, it looks amazingly like a telephone to me. But what it makes this is actually a very small two-port, layer 2 switch. You can see. So it allows me to have the phone is acting like a switch, and I get two devices on one switch port here, which is interesting because now I haven't used a port here. I've got an extra port that I can plug another device in. So I'll bring another device into the network here. Here's a video surveillance camera that we'll bring into the network. There we go. And you can see now that I have two devices on one port. Now, for the sake of our discussion with Joe, and to keep this simple, what we're going to do is we're going to connect our computer back directly to the switch. Just so you can see. Now, you're going to see that I'm going to use white cables to connect end devices to the network. So here we go. Here are our end devices. Great. Switch. We have to know what this switch is all about. Why did Joe bring in a switch? Well, he needed more ports. That was one sort of obvious thing. But a network switch connects endpoints together. Let me be more specific. A network switch connects endpoints to the network, right? And then ultimately they get connected together perhaps. And with a network switch like this, a more sophisticated product, it has distributed bandwidth. What that means is the bandwidth of this switch is 100 megabits, but now instead of being shared, each one of these ports, and there are 24 of them on this switch, each port has its own 100 megabits bandwidth. That's distributed bandwidth. Everybody has 100 megabits. Now, this switch builds a table of MAC addresses. Now, we should have learned some of that already. When we talked about OSI, we've talked about what MAC addresses are, how they relate. And so here's what the switch does. The switch, when it's plugged in, sends out a signal to all ports. And it says, hey, is anybody out there? And so this camera responds back, and it says, hey, here's my MAC address. And the switch doesn't care that it's a camera. He just takes the MAC address, puts it on the table, and says, okay, you're attached to port number 1. This MAC address, port number 1. The phone responds, here's my MAC address. And the switch adds it to the table and says, you're on port number 2. Computer says, here's my MAC address, port number 3. And the switch builds a table of MAC addresses, and it knows exactly where each MAC address lives. Remember, this is sort of like the address, the mailing address on the letter. That postal delivery guy has to know exactly where you live in order to deliver that, and the postal guy knows. So the switch builds a table of MAC addresses. That's a very simplistic way of describing it, but that's actually what happens. Now, the switch forwards packets, takes a packet of information, moves it along based on the MAC address, and the switch knows exactly where the MAC address lives. It's a layer 2 device. Switches are layer 2.